There are stories in history that refuse to die. They linger in the shadows, whispered, exaggerated, reshaped, until the truth is all but swallowed by legend. And then there is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, a name that has become synonymous with pure fear. A noblewoman who ruled vast lands, a widow with more power than most kings would ever allow. A woman accused of crimes so horrific that even today, centuries later, her name is spoken like a curse. But here's the part that history rarely asks. What if the legend of the Blood Countess was never meant to be believed? What if it was meant to destroy her? Because Elizabeth Bathory's story is not simply a tale of cruelty, it is a story of psychology, of politics, of fear, and of a society struggling to understand a woman who did not fit their rules. Tonight, we are not retelling the myth. We are dissecting the mind behind it, and the minds that shaped it. Elizabeth was born into privilege, one of the most powerful families in Eastern Europe. Her childhood was spent in castles, surrounded by wealth, education, and political expectation. She was taught languages, science, medicine, things most women of her time were deliberately kept away from. A woman with intelligence was already suspicious, a woman with power even more so. By her early adult years, Elizabeth was managing estates, commanding servants, settling disputes, and dealing directly with nobles. Her husband, often away at war, left the majority of their holdings under her control. To the outside world, she appeared calm, composed, emotionless, a woman carved from stone. But to the people who served her, she was something far more complicated, strict, disciplined, and fiercely attentive to detail. She enforced rules with cold precision. She expected perfection. She tolerated nothing less. And in a world where the powerful were feared and the powerless were silenced, people began to whisper about the Countess behind her back. As her influence grew, so did the unease. Local nobles watched her rise with narrowed eyes, particularly those whose lands bordered hers or whose fortunes were tied to her family's decisions. Elizabeth was wealthy. She was respected. She was untouchable. And that is when the first stories began. Stories of missing girls, stories of screams in the night, stories of cruelty behind the stone walls of her castle. But these were not accusations brought forward in courts. They were not written statements. They were rumors, whispered from servant to servant, passed in markets, spread by mouths that rarely spoke truth to power. Fear moves quietly through a community. It sinks into the mind, shaping everything it touches. And the fear surrounding Elizabeth Bathory was just beginning. Because the Countess, intelligent, intimidating, and unyieldingly strong, was not simply a woman of her time. She was a challenge to it, a challenge that powerful men would soon attempt to remove. Power rarely enters a room quietly. It arrives with weight, with expectation, with the echo of 1,000 eyes watching. For Elizabeth Bathory, power was not inherited. It was mastered. From the moment she married Ferenc Nadasdy, one of the most feared military leaders in Eastern Europe, her influence expanded beyond anything her childhood could have predicted. Their union was more than a marriage. It was a political alliance woven between two dominant dynasties. While Ferenc was away commanding armies, Elizabeth was not simply waiting in the shadows. She ran the estates. She resolved disputes. She managed finances that rivaled royal treasuries. She fed, clothed, and employed hundreds across her lands. And she did it all with an intelligence that unnerved the men around her. In private letters from the period, nobles described her as precise, unyielding, calculating, and unnervingly calm. To them, she did not behave like a noblewoman. She behaved like a leader, a role many believed she had no right to fill. Whenever Ferenc returned from war, stories followed him home. Brutal stories, victories soaked in violence, acts committed on the battlefield that would haunt any ordinary man. And yet, Elizabeth did not flinch. Some say the Countess was cold by nature. Others say she learned to be. because the world she lived in demanded it. The Bathory Nadasti estates became known for strict discipline, swift punishment, and unwavering control, a place where perfection was expected, and fear was the language spoken by those who served. But here is where psychology offers us a crucial insight. Environments of strict authority create fertile ground for rumor. The more rigid the hierarchy, the more dangerous the whisper beneath it. Servants talk, people exaggerate, mistakes turn into stories, stories turn into warnings, warnings turn into legends. And as Elizabeth's husband grew more violent in his military campaigns, the rumors circling their home twisted with each retelling. When Ferenc eventually died, Elizabeth inherited not only the full weight of their lands, but also the full weight of their reputation. She became the single most powerful woman in the region, a woman wealthier than most men, a woman capable of influencing trade, military resources, and political outcomes. And that was the moment everything changed, because power, especially when held by the wrong kind of person, creates opportunity for those waiting in the dark. Elizabeth's cousins, rivals, and political enemies saw her widowhood not as a tragedy, but as an opening. Her lands were coveted, her wealth was envied, and her independence was resented. In the eyes of many men of her time, a woman ruling alone was not simply unusual, it was dangerous, and dangerous things, in the minds of frightened people, must be controlled. So the whispers became louder, the rumors became sharper, and the tension that had been silently growing in the halls of Shaita Castle was about to snap. Because soon, those whispers would be weaponized, and Elizabeth Bathory, the powerful, educated, intimidating noblewoman, would become the perfect target. Rumors are harmless until someone decides to believe them. And rumors about Elizabeth Bathory had been accumulating like dry brushwood. All they needed was a spark. That spark arrived quietly, almost invisibly, through whispers in villages surrounding her estates. A servant girl who didn't return home. A mother claiming her daughter had vanished at the castle. A rumor of cruelty delivered by someone too frightened to speak clearly. In a different time, these concerns might have been investigated with care, but this was a world built on hierarchical power, where the word of a noble crushed the voice of a servant before it even formed. Yet as the years passed, the whispers spread faster than the truth could chase them. The psychology of fear is simple. When people believe they are powerless, rumors become protection, warnings, explanations for things they cannot control or understand. And Elizabeth Bathory, strict, emotionless, commanding, was the perfect villain for those stories. But here is the part often ignored. None of the accusations began in a courtroom. They began in kitchens, in servant quarters, in markets where fear mixed with imagination. Then something changed. A new rumor spread that Elizabeth Bathory was harming the young women she trained as servants. Girls brought into her household to learn nobility etiquette, housekeeping, literacy, skills for their futures. Some of these girls were daughters of lower nobles, and that, for the first time, made the whispers politically inconvenient. Because when the poor suffer, the elite look away. But when the elite begin to feel threatened, fear suddenly becomes an emergency. More stories surfaced, girls disappearing, suspicious injuries, strange behavior from servants who feared speaking openly. Were the stories true? Were they exaggerations? Were they inventions crafted to destroy her? At this point in the narrative, psychology cannot give us certainty, but it does give us patterns. Patterns showing how fear spreads, how rumors grow, how communities create monsters to explain the things they don't fully understand. And in the case of Elizabeth Bathory, the political climate was growing colder by the day. Her lands were dangerously valuable. Her position as a widow made her vulnerable. Her wealth made her a target. And the powerful men around her knew how to turn whispers into weapons. Enter Count Georgi Thurzo, a man with ambition, influence, and a long history of aligning himself with political advantage. He had been a friend to Elizabeth's late husband, but friendships among nobles are as stable as the alliances that create them. Thurzo heard the rumors. He listened to frightened nobles. He read the letters describing suspicious disappearances, and in those whispers, he saw opportunity. It was Thurzo who began collecting testimonies, not formally, not legally, quietly, strategically, carefully. He sent men to interview servants, often under conditions no modern justice system would tolerate. Testimonies were taken from people who feared punishment if they hesitated, who feared torture if they contradicted the expected story. And the stories they gave him were exactly what he needed. With each new accusation, the legend of Elizabeth Bathory grew, but so did Thurzo's political leverage. Finally, with the whispers sharpened into weapons, he made his move. He announced an official investigation, but he already knew what he wanted to find. Elizabeth Bathory's downfall was not triggered by evidence. It was triggered by the psychology of fear, the hunger for power, and the actions of men who believed she had too much of it. And the accusations, once spoken aloud, would become unstoppable. Because when a society decides someone is a monster, every shadow begins to look like proof. The moment Thurzo declared an investigation, Elizabeth Bathory's fate was no longer in her hands. It didn't matter what was true, it mattered what people were willing to believe. The investigation began not with facts, but with fear. Agents were sent across Bathory lands, questioning villagers, servants, distant relatives, anyone who had even the faintest connection to the Countess. And here is where psychology becomes crucial. When people are questioned by authority, they often tell the story they believe the questioner wants to hear, especially in an era where torture was considered a valid method of extracting truth. Witnesses described things they had never seen. Stories grew darker with each retelling. Servants contradicted each other, then aligned their stories under pressure. Confessions were taken by men holding whips. Declarations were made while staring at hot irons heating in the corner of the room. This was not an investigation. It was confirmation hunting, a psychological trap where fear produces the evidence itself. Not a single witness provided consistent detail. Not one story matched another. No physical evidence was found. None. But the more people spoke, the more real the legend became. Thurzo now possessed what he needed, a collection of testimonies that could be shaped into a narrative. A narrative where Elizabeth Bathory was not just strict or intimidating, but a woman capable of unthinkable cruelty. A narrative designed to justify removing her from power. But there is another side to this story, a side modern psychologists find deeply revealing. Elizabeth Bathory was intelligent, disciplined, and emotionally controlled. These traits in a patriarchal society were seen not as strengths, but as abnormalities. Women of her era were expected to be gentle, obedient, and silent. Elizabeth was none of those things. She managed estates with more efficiency than most men. She made decisions without hesitation. She commanded her staff with strict authority. Psychologically speaking, people feared what they could not categorize. A powerful woman was a threat. A powerful widow was an even greater one. And a powerful widow with vast lands, political influence, and no male protector. To the men around her, that was unacceptable. Thurzo played this fear perfectly. In politics, removing a man of influence required negotiation. Removing a woman of influence required only a story, and Elizabeth's story was being written for her. As the investigation continued, Thurzo's men entered Chester Castle. What they found was not a chamber of horrors. They found disorganization, fear, servants unsure of what to say, and a countess who did not seem aware she was already condemned. But psychology explains this too. People under suspicion often behave in ways that make them look guilty, not because they are guilty, but because they are afraid. Elizabeth Bathory was frightened, confused, angry, betrayed. And these emotions twisted by the investigators' expectations, only strengthened the narrative they already believed. The more she tried to defend herself, the more they decided she was lying. The more she questioned the accusations, the more they decided she was dangerous. She had become the villain in their minds long before the investigation began. And when a community convinces itself that a monster exists, it will reshape reality until it finds one. By the time Thurzo prepared his final report, the truth was irrelevant. He had what he needed: a woman whose reputation had been shattered, and a file thick enough to justify taking everything from her. Elizabeth Bathory was no longer a countess. She was a story, a symbol, a weapon. Her downfall was inevitable. When the time came to act, Count Georgi Thurzo did not move quietly. He arrived at Cheta Castle with soldiers, authority, and the confidence of a man who believed history would remember him as a hero. What followed was not an arrest. It was a performance. The halls of the castle were searched. Rooms were opened. Servants were interrogated on the spot. Any sign of disarray, a broken chair, a stained cloth, a frightened expression, was recorded as evidence. Historians later noted that Thurzo reported finding scenes that defied all logic, descriptions that read more like nightmare fantasies than factual observations. But psychology provides an explanation. When fear shapes expectation, people begin to see what they believe, not what is there. Elizabeth Bathory was placed under house arrest. She stood before men who had already decided her fate. She was questioned, accused, and denied a chance to defend herself in any meaningful way. But here is the truth, often excluded from the legend. Elizabeth Bathory never received a formal trial. The proceedings that surrounded her case were hearings, designed not to evaluate evidence, but to justify a predetermined outcome. The testimonies against her, nearly all taken under duress, were accepted without hesitation. The contradictions in the stories were ignored. The lack of physical evidence was dismissed. The context, political, social, and psychological, was conveniently excluded. Thurzo had what he wanted: the Countess's lands, control of her fortune, and the satisfaction of eliminating a political threat without facing resistance. As the hearings concluded, the outcome was decided. Elizabeth Bathory would not be executed. Execution would have caused public backlash. Her family was too powerful, her name too influential. Instead, she would be erased. She was sealed inside a small set of rooms in her own castle. Windows bricked over, doors reinforced, food delivered through a narrow slit in the wall. It was a living tomb, a psychological punishment disguised as justice. And outside her prison, a new legend was being crafted. Nobles whispered about the Blood Countess, each retelling more elaborate than the last. Stories spread across Europe, growing darker with every border they crossed. People love monsters. They fear them, yes, but they also depend on them, because monsters give shape to the parts of society no one wants to face. And Elizabeth Bathory became the perfect monster. A woman of power reduced to a cautionary tale. A noble turned into a symbol of cruelty. A threat transformed into a myth that justified her imprisonment. She spent the final years of her life in that bricked room, deprived of light, freedom, and truth. Not because she was proven guilty, but because powerful men needed her to be. The psychology of her downfall reveals the core of her story. Elizabeth Bathory was destroyed not by evidence, but by fear. Fear of her wealth, fear of her influence, fear of a woman who refused to break under the weight of a patriarchal world. The world needed her to be a monster, so it created one. And as she slowly faded from the world, the legend of the Blood Countess grew, fed by imagination, bias, and the dark corners of the human mind. A legend that would outlive her. A legend that would overshadow the truth for centuries. Legends survive for one reason. They tell us something about ourselves. And the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, has survived longer than most. But what survives is not always what is true. After her death, Bathory's story evolved without restraint. Writers reshaped her into a symbol of pure evil. Artists exaggerated her image, each version darker than the last. Folklore swallowed her whole, transforming an imprisoned noblewoman into a monster of mythic proportions. A woman who bathed in blood. A woman who could not feel empathy. A woman who committed horrors beyond imagination. None of it supported by evidence. All of it supported by fear. Psychology tells us that when a story taps into primal emotions, fear, disgust, fascination, it becomes almost impossible to erase. The mind remembers what shocks it. It forgets what challenges it. Elizabeth Bathory became a reflection of society's darkest fears. Fear of women with power. Fear of those who do not conform. Fear of authority without emotion. Fear of the unknown behind castle walls. She was the perfect vessel for superstition, for political ambition, for moral storytelling. A mirror onto which a frightened world projected its shadows. But modern historians and psychologists have begun to peel back the layers of the myth, and what they've uncovered is a very different picture. The testimonies against her were inconsistent, coerced, or impossible. The physical evidence was non-existent. Her political enemies had everything to gain from her destruction, and her strict, intimidating personality, unusual for a woman of her era, made her an easy target. So who was she truly? A strict noblewoman? Yes. A powerful widow, controlling vast lands? Absolutely. A figure both admired and feared, without question. But a monster born of cruelty? There is no proof. The psychological portrait that emerges is complex. A woman whose intelligence and authority threatened the fragile egos of the men surrounding her. A woman who became a symbol of everything her society did not want women to be: independent, educated, unapologetically powerful. And when a society fears a woman it cannot control, history has shown, again and again, that the consequences can be brutal. As the centuries passed, the world preferred the myth over the truth. The countess who killed countless victims is a far more thrilling story than the noblewoman destroyed by politics. But Dark Mind Lab asks a different question. What does it say about us that we remember the monster and forget the human? What does it reveal about the psychology of fear? About the stories we choose to keep alive? About the easy comfort of believing in evil when the truth is more complicated? Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is not the story of a woman who committed unimaginable acts. It is the story of a society that needed her to have done them. A society that used fear as a weapon, rumor as evidence, silence as complicity, and a story that has shaped the world's understanding of her for over 400 years. History remembers her as a monster, but psychology suggests something far more unsettling. She may have been innocent, and if the Blood Countess, the woman etched into darkness, was not what history claims, then how many other monsters were simply victims of power, fear, and the human need to create stories darker than the truth? Elizabeth Bathory's tale forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the scariest thing is not the monster in the legend. It's the people who write it.